Hello, I'm Rochelle Carey, and this is Al Jazeera bringing you special coverage of the unrest in the United States over the death of an unarmed black man in Minneapolis. For a fourth day now, there have been violent protests all across the country, from New York to Los Angeles. So as night falls across the U.S., curfews are now being enforced in more than a dozen cities. Los Angeles, Atlanta, Portland, and Denver are among those restricting movement to try to curb more violence. In Minneapolis, though, people are again defying the orders and continuing to make their voices heard on the streets. The state's governor has fully mobilized the National Guard for the first time in Minnesota's history. He says he still does not have enough troops. Tim Walz has also called on people to do their part to stop the violence. Scuffles have broken out between police and protesters in New York, where demonstrations are continuing into the night. At least 2 police cars have been set on fire, and thousands of people have demonstrated outside the city Supreme Court, on the Brooklyn Bridge, and outside a sports arena. Police cars also set on fire in Miami. What was initially a peaceful protest turned violent. Officers responded with tear gas and fireworks. A curfew has been in place there for just over an hour. So we have reporters standing by live in 4 major cities. Gabriel Elizondo is in New York. Andy Gallagher is in Miami. Rob Reynolds is in L.A. And in Minneapolis, where this all started, John Hendren. So Al Jazeera's John Hendren is there right now. So as we talked about, these curfews are in place. What is happening now, John? And if what I saw a little bit earlier, you were kind of in the thick of things as police were starting to sort of move in on people. Tell us what you've been experiencing.
That's right. We were standing in a spot where there was a very peaceful protest of hundreds of people going on. But that protest was right in front of a police station, and the police had manned that area the night before, so the protesters took it back, and the police came out in force. They threw grenades, smoke grenades, rubber bullets, and tear gas came out immediately. And I emphasize this was a peaceful protest that was going on at the time. The police then marched in a number of, as we were just preparing to get on air, we were tear gas, and these are the bullets that they were firing. They're sort of rubber pellets, and I've seen a number of people who have been hit by them. So the police have taken back an area, and one of the reasons that they may be able to do that is that the governor called in 1,000 extra National Guard troops. That makes 1,700 in total, in addition to all of the police who are here. So the police have pretty much clamped down. They seem to be enforcing the curfew tonight, but they haven't been able to do that all week, and there has been some violence, some looting of buildings. A number of buildings were set on fire, and we witnessed that last night.
So, John, obviously, what set all this off is decades and decades of racism and police brutality. But this particular thing obviously was about what happened to George Floyd. One officer has been arrested, Derek Chauvin, but one of the reasons that the protesters escalated this is because it took days to get that arrest, and there are still other officers that sat there and watched, perhaps participating, that have not been arrested. Has the governor or the mayor or anybody addressed what is going to happen with these other officers?
That's a good question. No, we don't know. And that's one of the reasons people are out in the streets. That one officer has been charged with murder, but 3 have not. And so many of the people I've talked to have said that that is a key goal of theirs. They want to see all 4 of those officers charged. But right now, there's just a standoff in the streets. Nobody's actually saying what's happening. The investigators have said they're looking into the case, but those 3 officers have not been charged as of now. And I just want to explain to you why we're here right now, Rochelle. We have a crowd of people all standing at this corner because what you can't see in the dark there is a line of police officers. Anybody who approaches that line gets a warning, and then rubber bullets are fired. So nobody is able to approach this entire area. Our car happens to be in there, so that's an inconvenience for the evening. But this is another night. If it continued to be peaceful throughout the city, it would be the first night since the death of George Floyd.
Okay, Gabriel Elizondo there at Ground Zero, where this all started in Minneapolis. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, John Hendren. Now let's go to Gabriel Elizondo, who is live in New York. So, Gabe, what is it that you are seeing there in New York?
One word, chaos is what we've seen in the last hour. So we're just about a block south of Union Square, very popular square in New York City. There has been mass protests, and we've also seen scenes like this, some scenes of smashed windows, There are protesters that had been gathering here in Union Square. Over the last hour or so, police came in to disperse some of them, but the scenes got very, very ugly here. This was after a day that we saw thousands of protesters marching through the streets of New York, mostly peaceful throughout the whole day, but then it got ugly. You can see that a van over there was burned. This was just in the last 45 minutes or so. You can see the remnants of trash cans off there on the right on the ground, as police are still here, just sort of cleaning up what's left of the absolute mess here. And you can see that the situation was not very good. Some of the protesters smashed NYPD police vans that you see here. What you're looking at here is a manifestation of anger. We've been speaking to people all day, young people, and they are furious, and they are taking out their anger, quite frankly, any way they can. Vast majority of the people, very much peaceful, it should be pointed out, practicing their First Amendment rights, if you will. But of course, there were some situations where it descended very much into chaos here, especially in this area around Union Square. We also saw protests in Brooklyn as well.
So, Gabe, I'm glad you brought that up, that this is a manifestation of a lot of anger. Almost every city where these protests are happening has their own personal high-profile case of a black man being killed in police custody and there not being any consequences for it. Amadou Diallo, Eric Bell, Eric Garner, I Can't Breathe, case after case after case. So while this may technically seem that it started in Minneapolis, there's a reason that these things are also happening in New York.
When it comes to police violence, New Yorkers know it very well. It's a very raw subject matter here. As you mentioned, 2014, Eric Gardner, an unarmed African-American man, was tackled by some NYPD officers. And as he was brought to the ground, there's that famous cell phone video of him saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." That led to protests here in New York and some around the U.S. as well. And that was 2014. So what we're doing is we're seeing this again. Many New Yorkers, especially young, brown, black, Latino, are seeing it again in Minneapolis. And they're finally saying, this is enough. Enough is enough. I've seen some real anger on the streets here that I just haven't seen previously in protests. And of course, you can see it here, but this is, of course, violent anger, what you're seeing here. But we should point out there were tens of thousands of people on the streets peacefully marching through New York as well. This is one part of it. It's just one snapshot of it. It's real. But of course, as you mentioned, this city, the people in this city know these situations like what happened in Minneapolis because they've lived it here before with very high-profile cases, the most recent being Eric Gardner in 2014, as you recall. And in that case, the officers that were involved were fired but weren't prosecuted.
And to that very point, when the officers are fired, they often get their jobs back. Or in the case of what happened with Eric Garner, it took 5 years for that officer to be terminated from the force. 5 years. Mayor de Blasio was the mayor at the time. Andrew Cuomo was the governor at the time. So while they may say now that they understand what the protesters feel, that may not resonate with the protesters.
It hasn't. You ask nobody on the streets that we've spoken to today wants to hear about de Blasio, the mayor, or the governor. Quite frankly, nobody cares that I've spoken to. They are out here because they said, we've seen this before. Now we're seeing a replay of this again. De Blasio, the mayor, the governor, they've all come out and said, we support the protesters. We too want justice for what happened in Minnesota. But the protesters here say, we've heard it before, we've heard it over and over, and that's why you see what you're seeing, the people out in these numbers.
Okay, Gabriel Elizondo with the latest on what's happening there in New York and the protests and the anger. Gabe, thank you very much. Let's go to Miami now, where Andy Gallagher is live for us there in the state of Florida. As I just mentioned to Gabe, Andy, every state has had their own personal experience with dealing with the death of a black man. And there being no consequences for it. Trayvon Martin, obviously, this happened in Florida. He was very young. He was killed by George Zimmerman, not a police officer, but someone who behaved as if he was, and there were no consequences. This has been building in a lot of states and a lot of places. What is happening in Miami?
Well, about an hour ago, I got a notice on my phone, an emergency alert saying that Miami-Dade County is now under curfew, like many other cities across this nation. Over the past few hours, we saw what started as peaceful demonstrations become something else entirely. In downtown Miami, protesters surrounded the main police station there. One car was set on fire. The I-95, the main highway that runs up the east coast of Florida, was partially closed for some time because the protesters moved up onto that highway, walking in between the cars. But as you said, there is a very real history here in the state of Florida, particularly with that case of Trayvon Martin, who was gunned down by George Zimmerman, a self-appointed neighborhood watch captain. That happened 8 years ago. It was a case I covered from the very start, and it was a case in which George Zimmerman was found not guilty by a jury. That still resonates with the African-American community here. That pain is still very real. And remember, just last month, the case of Arbery, I can't remember the man's name, in Georgia, who was basically corralled, Ahmaud Arbery, sorry, yes, who was corralled by two white men who armed themselves and killed him, one of them being a former police officer himself. And of course, then there were a Corey Jones case here just a couple of years ago. He broke down on the side of the road. He was also shot dead by a police officer who was also found innocent. So that pain particularly reverberates in this state. Remember, the Trayvon Martin case is what what kicked off the Black Lives Matter movement. But what we've seen here in Florida, all across the state, are small protesters, small groups of protesters, just a few hundred here and there, not the numbers we're seeing in New York, and certainly not like it is in Minneapolis. But nevertheless, that fear, that anger, that sense of injustice is really boiling over here, as it is in the rest of the country. The protests now in downtown Miami seem to have dispersed. I'm hearing reports that protesters turned up at the house of the police officer who had his knee on the neck of the man in Minneapolis for 9 minutes. He apparently had a second home here, so the police are also there as well. Still no word from Ron DeSantis, this state's governor, a close ally of President Trump. He hasn't made any public comments at all at the moment, but this state, or certainly this county, now under curfew. We'll have to see what the next few days and hours bring, but things certainly seem to be under control here in the state of Florida at the moment.
Okay, Andy Gallagher with the latest there in Miami, Florida. Thank you very much. Let's cross to the other side of the country now, the West Coast, where our Rob Reynolds is live in Los Angeles. So let's talk about the history of Los Angeles, Rob. Obviously, if you go back to 1992, there were the LA riots when the officers who beat Rodney King on video had minimal, if any, consequences at all. We're not seeing, obviously, the level of the LA riots there, but there's a history of anger and racial injustice in that city as well.
That's right, Rochelle. And as you rightly point out, it was not actually the beating of Rodney King, captured on camera and widely seen by everyone around the country, that spurred the worst of the rioting. It was a year later when the police officers who beat King were acquitted by a mostly white jury in a suburb of Los Angeles. That's what set the fuse and led to some of the worst rioting, certainly the worst rioting in this city, and probably some of the worst in the United States, at least in recent decades. Right now, we have confirmed that Mayor Eric Garcetti has asked the governor, Gavin Newsom, for the National Guard to be deployed in Los Angeles. The city, as of right now, is under a curfew beginning right now, and will extend until around dawn tomorrow morning. There has been extensive ransacking of stores, some high-end stores in some very posh shopping areas in Beverly Hills and other parts of West Side Los Angeles. People went in and took things that they certainly didn't pay for. Just in the last 20 minutes to 30 minutes or so, we learned of reports of the Los Angeles police firing rubber bullets and beanbag-type projectiles, as well as some tear gas at people who were trying to get into a grocery store. So things are not going well as night falls in Los Angeles.
Rob,
In fact, things are getting worse.
So let me ask you about that. So Los Angeles is an extremely spread out city, the greater Los Angeles area. Is this happening in just very concentrated, very specific areas?
You know, this is an area, the worst hit area is an area called the Fairfax District. This is, again, an area where there's a lot of shops, affluent area, not a high minority area like South Central LA was, which was convulsed by the riots of 1992. But it's a shopping area, a lot of entertainment and so on. Also in Beverly Hills, where there was some ransacking and some fires lit. So it has been concentrated in those areas. Now, on the contrary, on Friday night, there was widespread unrest in the very center of Los Angeles, including protesters blocking a major highway. And there were a lot of arrests, 500 arrests on the evening of Friday. So you can see these pictures here. People are going into stores and coming out with their hands full. It is ironic, Rochelle, that this weekend was supposed to represent a new phase of Los Angeles's reopening for business in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Instead, we have this.
And actually, Rob, I'm glad you brought that up, because none of what is happening in a vacuum. It is happening with the country, the world that is in the midst of one of the worst pandemics in history. Thousands of people are losing their jobs. Quite frankly, a U.S. president who throws rhetoric, incendiary rhetoric, into all of the mix. So when you put all of those things together, any one of those things themselves would be bad enough. When you put them all together, perhaps this is what you get.
And I would also add to that, Rochelle, that the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, in the cities of New York, Los Angeles, elsewhere, have hit the black and brown communities much harder than any other community. So that you have a disproportionate number of African Americans dying from the virus. That's all in the background as well. As you say, nothing happens in a vacuum. The enormous disruption that has happened as a result of the pandemic is certainly a factor here, as is the drumbeat of videos coming out one after the other showing a black man in North Carolina being gunned down by people as he took a jog, a woman in Central Park threatening to call the police on a black bird watcher and telling the police that he was threatening her when he wasn't. And then, of course, the really, I don't know what the word is, disgusting, perhaps, video from Minneapolis. So all of this, it adds up. I think it accumulates, and at a certain point, something breaks. And there's a lot of things breaking right now.
Well said, Rob Reynolds. And it's about 8:15 in the evening there in Los Angeles, so it's actually still fairly early. So keep an eye on things, and we'll get back to you. Thank you, Rob.